The steel-gray waters of the Philippine Sea reflected the ominous dawn of October 20th, 1944, as Admiral William Bull Housey stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS New Jersey. Unknown to him, the Japanese Imperial Navy was about to spring the most desperate gamble in naval warfare history, a coordinated four-pronged assault that would either crush the American invasion of the Philippines or mark the death throes of the rising sun's naval power forever. 3 days earlier, General Douglas MacArthur had made good on his famous promise, waiting ashore at Leyte with the words "I have returned" echoing across the Pacific. But Emperor Hirohito's admirals were not content to let the Philippines fall without the fiercest fight of their lives. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had activated Shogo One Victory Operation, one a plan so audacious it bordered on suicidal. The Japanese strategy was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope, for separate naval forces would converge on Leyte Gulf like the closing fingers of a giant's fist. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would lead the Northern Force, a collection of aircraft carriers that were little more than floating decoys. Their planes had been sacrificed in earlier battles, leaving them as bait to lure away the American fast carriers. From the west, Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the Center Force, a powerhouse formation built around the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, each mounting 18-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing as much as small automobiles, according to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's definitive account. In History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the Japanese committed virtually every remaining major warship to this operation. Meanwhile, Admiral Shoji Nishimura led the Southern Force through the Surigao Strait, while Admiral Kiyohide Shima commanded an additional striking force. Their mission was clear: break through the American defenses, destroy the vulnerable transport ships unloading supplies for MacArthur's troops, and turn Leyte Gulf into a graveyard for American ambitions in the Pacific. But the Americans were not caught sleeping. Admiral Chester Nimitz had assembled the largest naval armada in history to protect the Philippine invasion. The Third Fleet under Housey boasted 16 fast carriers and 6 new fast battleships, while Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet brought older battleships, escort carriers, and the crucial amphibious forces. Together, they commanded over 200 warships and nearly 2,000 aircraft. The stage was set for a battle that would dwarf all previous naval engagements. From October 23rd to 26th, these massive fleets would clash across an area larger than the state of Texas. The fate of the Pacific War and perhaps the entire Second World War hung in the balance. As the sun climbed higher over the Philippine waters, radar operators aboard American ships began detecting the first ominous blips that would signal the beginning of the largest naval battle in human history. The trap was about to be sprung, but the question remained: who would be the hunter, and who would be the prey? At 0-6-30 hours on October 23, 1944, Lieutenant Commander David McClintock aboard the submarine USS Daughter peered through his periscope into the pre-dawn darkness of the Palawan Passage. What he saw made his blood run cold with excitement. The unmistakable silhouettes of Japanese warships stretching across the horizon like a steel armada from another age. "Battle stations torpedo," McClintock whispered into the intercom, his voice tight with controlled anticipation. "We've got the whole damn Japanese Navy out there." Admiral Kurita's center force was steaming eastward in perfect formation. The massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, accompanied by the Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, along with 12 heavy cruisers and 15 destroyers. This was the spearhead of the Japanese assault. 32 warships carrying enough firepower to level a city, but they had walked directly into the path of 2 American submarines that had been prowling these waters like patient wolves. The Daughter and her sister boat, USS Stace under Commander Bladen Claggett, had been conducting a routine patrol when they stumbled upon the greatest prize in submarine warfare history. McClintock's hands moved with practiced precision as he set up his torpedo attack, the submarine's crew working in deadly silence as they prepared to strike the first blow of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. At 0-5-30 hours, 6 torpedoes erupted from the Daughter's tubes, their wakes cutting through the dark water like phosphorescent snakes. The first 3 slammed into Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Otago. In a thunderous explosion that lit up the night sky, the massive warship, pride of the Imperial Navy, began listing immediately as thousands of tons of seawater poured through her shattered hull. Naval records from the USS Daughter's War Diary, as documented in Clay Blair's Silent Victory, the U.S. submarine war against Japan, confirmed this historic moment when American submarines dealt the opening blow. Admiral Kurita found himself swimming for his life in the oil-slicked waters as his flagship died beneath him. But the American wolves weren't finished. The Dace, positioned perfectly for a follow-up attack, sent for torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Takao, crippling her so severely that she would spend the rest of the war limping back to Singapore for repairs. As rescue destroyers pulled the soaking Admiral Kurita from the water, he faced a terrible choice. His carefully planned formation was in chaos. One of his heavy cruisers was sinking, another was crippled, and the Americans now knew exactly where he was. The element of surprise so crucial to Japanese strategy was gone forever. But Kurita was a warrior of the old school, a man who had served the emperor for 30 years and had no intention of turning back now. Transferring his flag to the super battleship Yamato, he reformed his battered force and continued eastward toward his date with destiny. The Americans had drawn first blood, but the real battle was yet to begin. As the sun rose over the Philippine Sea, radio signals crackled between American ships, carrying news of the submarine attack to Admiral Halsey and his commanders. The Japanese were coming, and they were coming in force. But now the Americans had precious hours to prepare their own trap. The largest naval battle in history had begun not with the thunder of 16-inch guns or the roar of diving aircraft, but with the silent stalking of submarines beneath the waves. The wolves had struck, and the hunt was on. The morning sun of October 24th, 1944, transformed the Sibian Sea into a sheet of molten gold as Admiral Kurita's center force steamed steadily eastward, their wakes cutting white furrows through waters that would soon run red with blood. High above, invisible to the naked eye, American search planes from Task Force 38 circled like mechanical vultures, radioing back the positions of the Japanese fleet to Admiral Halsey's carriers. At 0800 hours, the first wave of American aircraft rose from the decks of the USS Intrepid, Cabot, and Independence like an angry swarm of hornets. 180 planes Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo planes formed up in the crystal morning air and turned west toward their prey. Leading them was Commander David McCampbell, already an ace many times over, his fighter painted with the kill marks of his previous victories. The target that drew every American pilot's attention was unmistakable: the Musashi, sister ship to the legendary Yamato and the largest battleship ever built. At 900 feet in length and displacing 73,000 tons, she was a floating fortress armed with 9 18-inch guns and protected by armor plating up to 26 inches thick. Her designers had boasted that she was unsinkable, a claim that the men of Task Force 38 were about to test. At 10:30 hours, the first American dive bombers screamed down through the flak-filled sky like falling meteors. The Musashi's anti-aircraft guns erupted in a thunderous barrage, filling the air with steel and fire, but the Americans kept coming. Commander Hugh Winters led his Helldivers into a near-vertical dive, releasing their 1,000-pound bombs at the last possible second, before pulling up through the deadly crossfire. According to the official action reports compiled in the Battle of Leyte Gulf by Edwin Hoyt, the first attack wave scored multiple hits on the super battleship, but her massive armor shrugged off the damage like a boxer absorbing body blows. But Admiral Halsey was just getting started. Wave after wave of American aircraft hammered the Japanese fleet throughout the day. The second attack came at noon, the third at 1:30, and still they kept coming. Each assault grew more focused, more deadly, as the American pilots learned the ship's weak points and adjusted their tactics accordingly. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the mighty Musashi was bleeding from a dozen wounds. Torpedo holes gaped in her sides below the waterline, bomb craters scarred her superstructure, and fires raged throughout her interior compartments. But still she steamed on, her massive bulk refusing to surrender to the sea. The fourth attack wave struck at 3:15, and this time the Americans concentrated everything on the dying giant. Torpedo after torpedo slammed into her port side, each explosion adding to the list that was slowly dragging her down. Commander McCampbell himself led a strafing run across her decks, his 6 machine guns chattering as they swept away the anti-aircraft gun crews. Admiral Inoguchi, the Musashi's captain, stood on his bridge watching his ship die around him. The deck was tilting at an impossible angle, seawater was pouring through countless holes in her hull, and still the American planes kept coming. At 4:20 hours, he gave the order that no Japanese naval officer ever wanted to give: abandon ship. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, the greatest battleship ever built rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves of the Sibian Sea, taking over 1,000 of her crew with her. The Americans had proven that in this new age of naval warfare, air power was king. and even the mightiest fortress could be sunk by determined aviators. But Admiral Kurita's remaining ships steamed on through the gathering darkness, bloodied but not beaten, still intent on reaching Leyte Gulf and the vulnerable American transports beyond. The tropical darkness of October 24th fell across the waters of Surigao Strait like a black velvet curtain, but beneath its cover, the naval forces were converging for a confrontation that would echo the greatest sea battles of history. Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force of battleships, one heavy cruiser, and for destroyers was steaming northward through the narrow waters, completely unaware that they were sailing into the most perfectly executed trap in naval warfare. Waiting for them in the darkness was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, a quiet man from California who was about to orchestrate one of the most decisive naval victories in American history. Oldendorf commanded 6 old battleships, veterans of Pearl Harbor who had been raised from the mud and rebuilt for revenge. The West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. Supporting them were 8 cruisers and 28 destroyers, positioned with mathematical precision across the mouth of the strait. At 11:36 p.m., the radar screens aboard the American ships began showing the distinctive blips of approaching warships. In the Combat Information Center of the flagship USS West Virginia, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagan watched the green dots creeping steadily northward and whispered to his plotting team, "Gentlemen, we're about to cross the T." Crossing the T, the ultimate dream of every naval tactician since Lord Nelson's time. It meant positioning your battle line perpendicular to the enemy's advance, allowing every gun in your fleet to bear on the leading enemy ships, while they could only return fire with their forward turrets. It was the perfect setup for a naval massacre. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive account in the Two Ocean War, this would be the last time in history that battleships would engage each other. In the classical line of battle formation, Admiral Nishimura pressed forward into the trap with the fatalistic courage of the samurai. His flagship, the battleship Yamashiro, led the way through the dark waters, followed by the Fuso and their escorts. Behind them, Admiral Shima's force of 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers followed, unaware that they were sailing into a slaughter. At 12:51 a.m. on October 25th, Oldendorf gave the order that every American battleship captain had been waiting 3 years to hear: open fire. The night exploded into pyrotechnic hell as 6 American battleships opened their main batteries simultaneously. The 14-inch and 16-inch guns thundered like the voice of an angry god, their muzzle flashes turning the darkness into strobing daylight. The shells screamed across the water in perfect salvos, guided by the most advanced radar fire control systems in the world. The Yamashiro, caught in the crossfire from multiple directions, staggered under the impact of repeated hits. Her superstructure collapsed in avalanches of twisted steel. Fires erupted throughout her length, and still the American guns kept firing. Within minutes, she was a flowing furnace, her crew dying at their posts as they tried desperately to return fire. The destroyer USS Melvin, racing in for a torpedo attack, found herself so close to the burning Japanese flagship that her crew could see individual figures silhouetted against the flames. Lieutenant Commander John McIsaac launched his torpedoes at point-blank range, then swung his ship away as explosions lit up the night behind him. By 3:20 a.m., it was over. The Yamashiro had rolled over and sunk, taking Admiral Nishimura down with her ship. The Fuso had been blown apart by a magazine explosion that could be seen 20 miles away. Of the 7 Japanese ships that had entered Surigao Strait, only 1 destroyer escaped to tell the tale. Admiral Shima, arriving late to find the strait filled with burning oil and debris, took one look at the carnage and ordered his force to retire. The samurai had met their match in the darkness, and the southern prong of the Japanese assault was finished. As dawn broke over the blood-stained waters, Admiral Oldendorf's victory was complete. But elsewhere in the Philippine Sea, the greatest drama of the battle was yet to unfold. October 25th, 1944 dawned gray and forbidding over the Philippine Sea. But for Admiral William Bull Halsey, standing on the bridge of the New Jersey, the morning brought the most agonizing decision of his naval career. For 100 miles to the north, Admiral Ozawa's Japanese carrier force was steaming south, their flight deck seemingly loaded with aircraft that could devastate the American invasion fleet. Very instinct Halsey possessed screamed at him to attack these carriers with everything he had. But unknown to him, he was about to fall victim to the most successful naval deception in history. Admiral Ozawa's northern force was indeed built around for aircraft carriers, the fleet carriers, Zuikaku and Zuiho, and the light carriers Chiros and Chiyoda. But these proud ships were hollow shells, their hangars nearly empty. Their air group sacrificed in earlier battles. Ozawa had fewer than 100 aircraft among all four carriers combined, barely enough to launch a single meaningful strike. His mission was not to fight, but to die gloriously while drawing the American fast carriers away from Leyte Gulf. At 6:30 a.m., Ozawa launched 7 to 6 planes in what he knew would be their final attack. The small formation headed south toward Halsey's Task Force 38. But this was no serious assault, it was an elaborate ruse designed to get Halsey's attention. The Japanese pilots, many of them barely trained teenagers, were sacrificing their lives not for victory, but to make their carriers look threatening enough to lure away the American fleet. Halsey took the bait completely. When his radar operators reported the incoming Japanese strike, every aggressive instinct in his warrior soul demanded action. Here were the enemy carriers he had been hunting for months, apparently launching major attacks against his fleet. At 8:20 a.m., he made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered Task Force 34, his entire battle line of 6 fast battleships and supporting cruisers, to join his carriers in pursuing Ozawa's force northward. As detailed in Admiral Halsey's own memoir, Admiral Halsey's Story, this moment represented the culmination of Japanese strategic deception and American tactical aggression. But 300 miles to the west, Admiral Kurita's battered center force was emerging from San Bernardino Strait like a steel phoenix, rising from the ashes. The previous day's air attacks had cost him the super battleship Musashi and several other ships, but he still commanded 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers to light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Most importantly, he was now steaming toward Leyte Gulf with no American fast battleships or fleet carriers to oppose him. Halsey had taken them all north. The only force standing between Kurita and the helpless American transports was Admiral Clifton, Ziggy Sprague's task unit 7-7.4.36 escort carriers, and 7 destroyers, units never designed to fight battleships. The escort carriers, converted from merchant ship hulls, carried anti-submarine aircraft and close support planes for the troops ashore. Their thin hulls and minimal armament made them sitting ducks for Kurita's heavy guns. At 6:45 a.m., lookouts aboard the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay spotted the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships rising over the horizon. Admiral Sprague, a quiet man from Kansas, stared at the approaching enemy fleet through his binoculars and muttered what would become one of the most famous quotes of the Pacific War: "Holy cow, they've got us bracketed." The trap had been sprung perfectly. Halsey was chasing empty carriers for 100 miles to the north, while the real Japanese striking force was bearing down on the most vulnerable part of the American fleet. In the greatest naval battle in history, the decisive moment had arrived, and it seemed that all the advantages lay with the rising sun. But Admiral Sprague and his small force of escort carriers and destroyers were about to write one of the most heroic chapters in naval warfare, proving that courage and determination could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. At 6:58 a.m. on October 25, 1944, the morning calm off Samar Island was shattered by the thunder of Admiral Kurita's 16-inch guns, as the Japanese center force opened fire on Admiral Sprague's tiny escort carrier force. The massive shells, each weighing as much as a small automobile, screamed overhead with the sound of freight trains, sending geysers of seawater towering hundreds of feet into the air. As they bracketed the fleeing American ships, Admiral Sprague faced impossible odds. His 6 escort carriers Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Cullinan Bay, Kitkin Bay, and Gambier Bay were merchant hulls converted for anti-submarine warfare with thin armor, light armament, and a top speed of 18 knots. Racing toward them at 28 knots were 4 Japanese battleships, led by the mighty Yamato, supported by 6 heavy cruisers whose 8-inch guns could punch through escort carrier armor like paper. But Sprague was a fighter, and he had 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts commanded by officers who understood that this day would demand everything they had to give. At 7:03 a.m., he ordered his screening ships to attack, knowing he was sending them against impossible odds, but understanding that only their sacrifice could buy time for his carriers to escape. Commander Amos Evans aboard the destroyer USS Johnston didn't wait for orders. The moment he saw the Japanese battleships, he spun his ship toward the enemy and increased the flank speed, black smoke pouring from her stacks as her crew pushed the engines beyond their design limits. The Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, fast and deadly, but she mounted only 5 5-inch guns against the Yamato's 9 18-inch monsters. At 7:15 a.m., the Johnston launched her 10 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano, then turned to engage with her guns. Her 5-inch shells, tiny compared to the massive projectiles flying around her, nonetheless found their mark on the cruiser's bridge, killing her captain and throwing the Japanese formation into confusion. According to the official Navy Department communique, published in the Battle off Samar by James Hornfisher, this single destroyer's attack disrupted the entire Japanese formation at the crucial moment. But Evans was just getting started. As Japanese shells began finding the Johnston, tearing away sections of her superstructure and killing men at their stations, he continued to attack. His ship was slowing, bleeding from dozens of wounds, her forward guns destroyed, but still she fought on like a wounded tiger. Meanwhile, the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, was making her own desperate charge. The Roberts was the smallest ship in the American formation, a tin can designed for convoy escort duty, but Copeland drove her straight at the Japanese battle line like a modern David charging Goliath. For 2.5 hours, the little Roberts traded shots with heavy cruisers, her single 5-inch gun firing so rapidly that it glowed cherry red. When her ammunition ran low, her crew formed human chains to pass shells from the stern magazine, working frantically as Japanese shells exploded around them. At 9:35 a.m., a salvo from the heavy cruiser Chikuma finally found her engine room, and the gallant little ship began to die. The escort carriers, meanwhile, were launching every plane they had, even if they were loaded with depth charges meant for submarines. The pilots of Composite Squadron 7 and 4 dove at Japanese battleships with anti-submarine rockets, making dry runs when they had no weapons left, anything to distract the enemy gunners and buy precious minutes for their ships. At 8:20 a.m., the Gambier Bay, slowest of the escort carriers, finally succumbed to the heavy cruiser's fire. She was the first American carrier sunk by surface gunfire since the beginning of the war, her crew abandoning ship as she rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves. But then, at 9:23 a.m., something extraordinary happened. Admiral Kurita, with victory in his grasp and the American formation scattered and bleeding, suddenly ordered his fleet to withdraw. The man who had steamed through submarine attacks in air raids, who had pressed forward despite losing his flagship and the mighty Musashi, lost his nerve at the moment of triumph. The heroes of Samar had achieved the impossible. Through raw courage and desperate sacrifice, they had convinced the Japanese admiral that he faced a much stronger force than reality. The greatest naval victory in Japanese history slipped through their fingers, turned back by the incredible bravery of ordinary American sailors who refused to surrender. The crimson sun of October 26, 1944, rose over Philippine waters stained with oil and littered with the debris of the greatest naval battle in human history. As the final act of the Battle of Leyte Gulf played out, Admiral Halsey's Task Force 38 finally caught up with Admiral Ozawa's decoy carrier force. For 100 miles north of the main action, unaware that they had been brilliantly outmaneuvered by Japanese strategic deception, Ozawa's carriers were doomed, and he knew it. His mission had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He had lured away the entire American fast carrier force at the crucial moment, giving Kurita's battleships a clear path to Leyte Gulf. That the center force had inexplicably turned back at the moment of victory was a tragedy beyond his control. Now all that remained was to die with honor, taking as many Americans with him as possible. At 800 hours, the first American airstrike from the Intrepid and Cabot found the Japanese formation. The light carrier Chitos died quickly under a hail of bombs and torpedoes, rolling over and sinking within minutes. The Zuiho fought longer, her anti-aircraft guns spitting defiance at the diving Hellcats, was she to succumb to the overwhelming American assault. By 10:30 a.m., only the fleet carrier Zuikaku remained afloat, the last survivor of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. Admiral Ozawa stood on her bridge, watching his escorts die around him, knowing that he had accomplished his mission even though it had cost him everything. At 11:14 a.m., the final airstrike arrived, and the Zuikaku joined her sisters on the bottom of the Pacific, taking with her the last hopes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. According to official records compiled in the Great Pacific Victory by Gilbert Kent, the destruction of Ozawa's carriers marked the effective end of Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force. But even as Halsey's pilots celebrated their victory in the north, disaster struck the American forces off Samar. At 10:50 a.m., a single Japanese aircraft dove out of the clouds toward the escort carrier St. Lo, her pilot intent on the newest form of warfare, the deliberate suicide attack that the Japanese call Egg Kamikaze, the Divine Wind. The Zero fighter, loaded with explosives and piloted by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, smashed through the St. Lowe's flight deck and detonated in her hangar bay. The explosion touched off ammunition and aviation fuel, turning the little carrier into a floating inferno. Within 30 minutes, she had sunk. The first American ship destroyed by organized kamikaze attack, a harbinger of the terrible battles yet to come. As the guns fell, silent across the Philippine Sea, both sides counted their losses from 4 days of unprecedented naval warfare. The Japanese had lost for aircraft carriers 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, virtually the entire remaining strength of the combined fleet. American losses were far lighter: 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort, along with several hundred aircraft. But the true measure of victory was strategic. MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines would continue, protected by American naval supremacy that was now unquestioned. The Japanese Empire, cut off from its conquered territories by American submarines and surface forces, began its final descent toward surrender. Admiral Kurita, the man who had come closest to achieving a great Japanese victory, would spend the rest of his life haunted by his decision to withdraw as Samar. In turning back from what appeared to be certain victory, he had saved his remaining ships but lost the war. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was over. America had won the largest naval battle in history through a combination of technological superiority, tactical flexibility, and the incredible courage of men like Commander Evans of the Johnston and Lieutenant Commander Copeland of the Samuel B. Roberts. The Pacific War would continue for another 10 months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The rising sun was setting forever on the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the stars and stripes would soon fly over Tokyo Bay.